Selecting a theoretical framework does not begin with scanning a list of widely cited theories. It begins with your phenomenon, your tension, and your consequence. These three elements narrow the field before you ever name a theory. Theory should not be selected because it is popular, familiar, or frequently used in your discipline. It should be selected because it helps you interpret the structural tension embedded in your problem and render that tension analytically visible. The phenomenon tells you what is happening. The tension tells you where the contradiction, friction, or misalignment lies. The consequence tells you why that unresolved dynamic matters. Theoretical fit is located at the point of tension. If the tension is unclear, theory selection will feel arbitrary. When the tension is conceptually precise, theory becomes easier to locate, because you are looking for a lens that clarifies that structural contradiction rather than a label that matches your topic. Begin with the phenomenon. Be specific. In this case, the phenomenon is AI tools functioning as scaffolds for learner independence. Clarify the tension. Traditional accommodations support task completion, but may not foster autonomous initiation. Support and independence appear structurally misaligned. Identify the consequence. Learners may internalize dependency, experience sustained anxiety, or develop fragile self-efficacy that extends into adulthood. Once these are articulated, the theoretical search becomes focused. The question shifts from what theories relate to AI to what theories help make sense of the relationship between support, autonomy, and identity development. A topical match is not the same as a tension-based match. For example, technology acceptance theory might appear relevant because the study involves AI. However, if the central tension is not adoption or usability but autonomy versus dependency, that theory may not illuminate the underlying contradiction. It addresses the topic but not the analytic fault line at the center of the problem. Theoretical alignment becomes visible when a theory helps clarify the instability you identified. In the AI example, several lenses may plausibly align. Self-efficacy theory might help interpret how learners describe confidence, perceived capability, mastery experiences, and persistence. It provides analytic leverage for understanding how beliefs about competence shape action. Sociocultural theory might help interpret the role of mediation, tools, and social interaction in shaping autonomy. It allows examination of how assistance and artifacts structure participation and development. Identity development theory might help interpret how repeated experiences of support or dependence shape self-concept over time. The phenomenon remains constant. The tension remains constant. The consequence remains constant. What changes is the analytic dimension of the unresolved dynamic you foreground. Now consider a full decision walkthrough. The phenomenon is first-generation college students navigating interaction with faculty. The tension is that universities promote belonging and access, yet students report hesitation, uncertainty about norms, and avoidance in approaching faculty. The consequence is reduced access to mentorship, research opportunities, and academic capital. Possible theories include belonging theory, social capital theory, and imposter phenomenon theory. Belonging theory would help interpret feelings of inclusion or exclusion. Imposter phenomenon theory would help interpret internalized self-doubt. Social capital theory would help interpret access to networks, informal knowledge, and institutional navigation. If interviews emphasize feelings of not fitting in or perceived exclusion, belonging theory may align strongly. If interviews emphasize internal narratives of fraudulence, imposter phenomenon theory may align. If interviews emphasize lack of knowledge about office hour norms, uncertainty about academic etiquette, and absence of informal mentorship, social capital theory may provide the clearest analytic leverage. Suppose participants repeatedly describe not knowing how to initiate conversations, lacking insider knowledge about expectations, and feeling unsure about informal academic rules. In that case, social capital theory most directly clarifies the structural tension. Belonging theory addresses emotional experience, but does not fully interpret navigation barriers. That elimination step demonstrates theoretical discernment. At this point, discernment becomes visible. The task is not selecting the most sophisticated theory. The task is selecting the theory that clarifies the specific instability revealed in the tension. The search process can also be modeled explicitly. If the tension centers autonomy versus dependency, search using the language of the unresolved dynamic rather than the language of topic. Searches such as autonomy development theory, dependency formation theory, mediated learning and autonomy, identity formation and scaffolding, or self-regulation development framework move toward explanatory lenses rather than surface-level topical matches. Now consider an example of weak alignment based on topical matching. The phenomenon is AI scaffolding independence. The tension is autonomy versus dependency. The consequence is identity development and anxiety. Technology acceptance theory may seem appealing because the study involves technology, but it explains adoption and perceived usefulness. The instability here is not adoption. It is whether support structures cultivate autonomy or reinforce dependency. This represents weak alignment through topical matching. Consider a second example of weak alignment based on vagueness. The phenomenon is students deciding whether to disclose disability accommodations. The tension is that supports exist, yet disclosure carries social and academic risk. The consequence is avoidance of accommodations and chronic stress. Selecting a broad label such as motivation theory without specifying a defined theoretical tradition does not guide interpretation. Without articulated constructs and mechanisms, the framework cannot clarify stigma, identity management, or institutional climate. This represents weak alignment through lack of specificity. Consider a third example of weak alignment based on overimposition. The phenomenon is nurses using electronic documentation systems. The tension is that efficiency goals conflict with relational care. The consequence is emotional exhaustion and identity strain. If a researcher selects a predetermined theory of resistance to change and forces all findings into that explanation regardless of participant language, the framework overrides the data. Even if resistance appears, the structural tension may center moral distress, workflow design, or professional identity transformation. A theory becomes misaligned when it dominates rather than clarifies participant meaning. Overfitting is another risk. If the tension is rewritten to better match a preferred theory, the analytic logic has been reversed. The theory must clarify the tension. The tension should not be reshaped to protect the theory. Two alignment tests can help prevent these errors. First, if the theory were removed, would interpretive clarity about the tension be lost? Second, can you clearly articulate how the theory helps interpret participant language about the unresolved dynamic? Consider how theory shapes interpretation of the same participant statement. A participant says, "I don't start assignments unless someone tells me exactly what to do." Through a self-efficacy lens, this may indicate low perceived capability or limited mastery experience. Through a socio-cultural lens, it may indicate sustained reliance on external mediation structures. The data remain the same. The analytic emphasis shifts depending on the theoretical lens. This demonstrates that theory is not decorative. It shapes what becomes visible and how the instability is understood. In writing, weak theoretical justification might sound like this. This study is grounded in self-efficacy theory because it examines confidence. A stronger alignment sounds like this. This study uses self-efficacy theory to interpret how participants describe task initiation, perceived competence, and persistence in relation to AI scaffolds, particularly where support structures appear to reinforce or weaken beliefs about capability. The second version explicitly connects theory to the tension and clarifies how it will guide interpretation. Sometimes no existing theory fully captures the instability you have identified. In those cases, theory may function as a sensitizing orientation rather than a comprehensive explanatory frame. The goal is analytic clarity and coherence. The theoretical framework interprets the tension. The conceptual framework organizes all major concepts shaping the study, including contextual conditions and working definitions. Maintaining this distinction preserves structural coherence. Phenomenon tension. Consequence narrows the field of theoretical possibilities. It shifts theory selection from preference to principled alignment. The question becomes what theory helps make sense of the structural tension at the center of the problem. When theory is selected through this process, coherence extends across chapters. The theoretical framework anchors interpretation, supports methodological decisions, and strengthens analytic defensibility. Theory selected by preference creates fragmentation. Theory selected through phenomenon, tension, consequence creates disciplined alignment.